to Connect, the space where we challenge outdated narratives and lean more into ways of supporting neurodivergent individuals. I'm your host, Sonja Engelbrecht, the head of the Oakley House Training and Support Center, a neurodivergence advocate and coach, a mother of two incredible children, and a professional who spent 2 decades walking alongside families, educators, and children on this journey. Our guest for today is Megan Stapelberg, an international counseling psychologist and registered counselor who works with children, teens, and families from a brain-based perspective. She specializes in providing online therapy for internationally mobile families, helping parents understand behavior through the lens of the nervous system rather than blame or discipline. Megan integrates polyvagal theory, developmental neuroscience, and attachment science into her work, empowering parents to build safety, regulation, and connection at home. She is passionate about helping families move from overwhelm to understanding, one nervous system at a time. Megan, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Sonja. It is such a privilege to be able to connect with you and your listeners today. And I'm very, very excited to share some of my knowledge on the topic at hand today.
We're very happy to have you. So before we start, Megan, in our meetups prior to the podcast and where we discussed what we were going to talk about, we obviously came up with a polyvagal theory as a topic. Why is it specifically that you wanted to talk about this today?
I think it's something that a lot of parents will be able to relate to once I actually understand the application of this theory in their everyday lives. And I thought I'd take the parents somewhere in their imaginations just for a second and to take them to a moment where it's the end of the day. Their child has just come home from school and they ask their child a simple question, something like, "How was your day?" Or, "Won't you please quickly go and put your shoes away?" And suddenly, out of nowhere, everything explodes. The child snaps, the child melts down, the child refuses to cooperate. Maybe they then start shouting, they slam a door, or they just completely shut down. And as the parent, they're standing there thinking, what just happened? It was such a small moment of me just asking how my child's day was or to put their shoes away, and it turned into this big reaction. And so what happens is that in this moment, many parents assume their child's behavior is the problem. Maybe the child is being defiant or difficult or choosing not to cooperate. But what if there's something else beneath the surface that we could look at instead? And what if the behavior that we see in our children is actually the nervous system reacting to stress? And that's what we're going to talk about today. This polyvagal theory that you've mentioned, Sonja, which is going to help us understand why these moments happen and why some children just experience the world much more intensely than others.
So it sounds to me, Megan, like you are saying that usually as parents, I mean, we've all experienced as parents, those of us who are parents, this exact moment, at least once, if not every day. So it sounds to me like what you are saying is as parents, we tend, and even professionals, we tend to focus on the behavior. But what it sounds like is that from your recommendation, we should focus on the nervous system rather. What does that mean?
So traditionally, we are all taught as parents, but also even as professionals, as teachers, that we need to focus on behavior. And that behavior is something that a child is always choosing. He's choosing to be naughty. He's choosing to be disobedient. And then we try to correct that. We try to discipline the behavior. We try to manage the behavior. But what this lens is offering, that I am proposing that we look at today, the lens of the nervous system, it offers the opportunity to ask different questions. So we don't ask, how do I stop the behavior? We ask, what state is this child's nervous system in right now? And why do I say this? Behavior is ultimately a visible expression. of what is happening on the inside of the body. So if a child feels really safe, really regulated, their brain is going to be let's use the classroom space as an example, their brain will be available for learning, cooperation, connection. But if in opposite terms, the nervous system is detecting threat, the nervous system feels quite unsettled, unsafe, the brain's response is going to be, I need to shift into survival mode. And in that state, the brain's goal will never be to learn or to listen, but rather to protect, because the nervous system senses threat. So if we focus on the nervous system, it's going to help us understand that many behaviors, not all, but many behaviors are actually signals of stress and not signs of defiance or bad behavior per se.
I mean, as you're explaining, Megan, what I'm thinking is, don't we all experience that as adults as well? It's not necessarily a child with difficulties or behavioral difficulties that experiences. If I think of when we sit in traffic, or if a car drove into me or whatever, and my whole central nervous system is in distress, my first thought is not, oh, how should I behave in this moment? I mean, we very often reactive in that moment. And it sounds like that is exactly what you're explaining, that kids are experiencing that fight, flight, freeze, fawn, whatever our go-to is when our nervous system is not regulated at that stage.
You've hit the nail on the head. Yes, exactly. In that moment, when a car crashes into you, as an adult, your response will be survival, protection, not only of yourself, but if you have children or other passengers in the car, your response will be, how can I keep myself and everyone else in this car safe? And not, what is the most appropriate way to behave in this moment once this car has crashed into me? Absolutely.
Yeah. Definitely not. So my question now is, so in terms of the topic, we said we're going to discuss the polyvagal theory. So you have now explained to us, or almost a suggested shift in focus from looking at the behavior, the outcome, what you see on the outside, to more questioning what this child is experiencing from a central nervous system perspective. So can you briefly explain the polyvagal theory? What does it have to do with what you just explained? What is it, and why does it matter in understanding the children?
So polyvagal theory was developed by an American psychologist, Dr. Stephen Porges, and in essence, based on what I've explained already, it helps us to understand how our nervous systems, all of us, adults and children, they're constantly busy scanning our environment for any cues of safety or danger, because it's the purpose of our nervous system ultimately is to protect us, to make sure that we survive. And that is really the primary job. It needs to help us stay alive. And to do that, our nervous system will shift into different states depending on what it detects in the environment around us. So if we feel really safe and connected, we'll be calm, we'll feel engaged, we'll be able to think clearly. And that is ultimately a state in which we are able to, if we are a child, we'll show up in the classroom being able to engage and learn and focus and socialize with our peers. Then the nervous system can also shift into a state of danger where it senses a form of danger. And here it's important to state that danger isn't always equivalent to a lion running into my house and biting my head off. It can also be equivalent to a teacher who always pinpoints me as the one who is disobedient, who's not paying attention in the classroom. It isn't always necessarily linked to physical danger, but also perceived danger, perceived threat. And so when our nervous system senses that, it mobilizes us to get into a state of, like you mentioned, Sonja, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, which might look like anger, feeling anxious, running away, resisting. It'll show up in all kinds of ways. And then finally, if our nervous system detects a sense of overwhelming threat, be it perceived or actual threat, it can move into a state of shutdown. And here we see children and adults who withdraw entirely, or they freeze, or they just seem entirely disconnected from the environment, but also the people around them. And what's so powerful about this theory is that it helps us to understand that behavior isn't always a conscious choice. Often, a child's nervous system has already made the decision of how it is the child is going to behave based on what it is that they're detecting in the environment around them.
One of my friends who's a psychologist, we often talk about the big T's and the small T's. And the big T's are in relation to trauma now. So the big T's are often things like being hijacked or, big trauma events. But the reality is that our body and our central nervous system responds exactly the same to the little T's, to those perceived threats. It's the same physical response. So even cognitively, we sometimes dismiss that as, it's not a real threat because it's not a big T. Our body still responds and reacts in exactly the same way with those little perceived threats and things like that. It reminds me of that book, The Body Keeps the Score. So it reminds me of that. So, but you have now mentioned that, Megan, behavior is state dependent. But what does it mean in everyday parenting?
It's very simple if we look at it from a nervous system perspective, because what a child can do depends on the state of the nervous system. The same with us. In that car accident example, you would most likely not be able to get out of your car calmly and tell the person who drove into you, hello, can you please tell me, what is your name? Can you please give me your license? What is the reason for you driving into me? You will most likely either have a bit of a scream fest at this person or freeze entirely behind your steering wheel. And the exact same thing applies to your child. What they can do in a moment is dependent on the state of their nervous system. So we can think of it this way. A child who feels really safe and regulated will be able to listen, to learn, problem solve, and cooperate. So if we take this into a home situation, if you would like to be able to connect with your child so that they can cooperate with what it is that you are asking of them to do, if they are in a state of fight or flight, you will most likely not elicit that behavior from them that you are after, that cooperative behavior. So if their nervous system is in survival mode, the ability to be able to cooperate, listen, concentrate will go offline. They're not able to actually access any of those kinds of skills because of the state of their nervous system in that moment. And what's also important to remember is that in terms of looking at this from a parenting perspective, one moment a child can appear calm and cooperative, and that can shift to the next moment where they feel entirely overwhelmed. And that's all got to do with that shift in our nervous system state, which is very fluid. And this can often be quite confusing for parents because it seems inconsistent, right? One moment my child is actually able to cooperate and listen to my instructions, and the next it just goes right out the door. But it makes perfect sense if we look at it from the lens of our nervous system state will drive our behaviors, whether we are a child or an adult.
Yes, Megan, I often hear that where either parents or professionals that I train or coach work with, where they say, but the child can do, they would think that the child is deliberately not listening because they were able to do it yesterday, so why can't they today? So they often see that as a willful decision to not comply, because why were they able to do it yesterday? But from what you explained, I think the other day I had to sign into hospital for some reason, and I couldn't remember my ID number. We all know our ID numbers in our sleep by now, but because of obviously the nervous state that I was in, I just couldn't. I literally had to go and find my ID number to give my ID number. So it's exactly the same thing. It sounds like that the kids are experiencing.
Exactly. You've pinpointed something. It's a beautiful example with accessing your ID number. you were most likely trying to rely on your prefrontal cortex at the front of your brain, where you rely on logic and reasoning in a certain situation. You logically know what your ID number is, right? But due to somewhat of a different state that you were in, maybe fight, maybe flight, some kind of fearful response that your nervous system was in, your prefrontal cortex actually went offline. And you couldn't access something as simple as your ID number. And so if a child is in that similar state and we want to push logic into their brains and say, but these are the consequences when you do A, B, and C. And I know you can do X, Y, and Z. It lands on deaf ears because their ability to actually access and process the logical explanation that you are trying to give to them, they can't access that at that moment because of the nervous system state that they are in.
A big theme in my training sessions for professionals is being mindful. I call it being mindful by design. It's being mindful. And I want to, at this stage, just challenge teachers and professionals and even parents to just take a moment maybe to reflect on what would happen if a child is in that state that we're explaining, like I was in that hospital where I couldn't remember. What happens if your approach to that is frustration? And I've asked you this yesterday and you knew this yesterday. Why don't you know it today? And that versus an approach of understanding to say, I can see that you are having a difficult time at the moment. Maybe we can come back to this question a little bit later. Maybe just a moment to pause and reflect on the difference in response from the child if having those two different approaches in that specific moment. So Megan, I'm going to move over to neurodiversity because that's what we do best. Why do many neurodivergent children experience the world so intensely?
In my view, based on, if we continue to look from the lens of polyvagal theory, of course, because that's the theory that we are using today in our discussion. My theory is that many neurodivergent children have nervous systems that are simply more sensitive to the input that they receive. And it's most likely that their brains may process sensory information, social cues, or even unpredictability more intensely than a neurotypical child. So something might feel really manageable for one child, a noisy classroom, a change in routine, a somewhat confusing social interaction, and another child might experience that as incredibly overwhelming. And it's not that these neurodivergent children are overreacting in their response to these particular examples that I gave. It is that their nervous system is registering more information more quickly and more strongly. And hence they'll have a reaction to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you are referring to the sensory differences, and I specifically now refer to kids who are neurodivergent. But I'm also cautious of always, I want to say, blaming it on neurodivergent because sometimes it's just an individual preference. I know many people, children, adults who are perceived as neurotypical, not necessarily neurodivergent or neurodivergent, with different sensory profiles and sensory differences and experiencing sensory input differently.
Absolutely.
So why might a child, I think you tapped on it at the beginning of when you started, but why is it that a child may appear calm in one environment, but they are completely overwhelmed in another? So obviously the central nervous system, it's the same child with the same central nervous system response to different input. Why is it that they appear calm in one environment, but maybe overwhelmed in another?
I think it's based on the fact that different environments that a child might find themselves in will offer different cues of safety or of threat. For example, a child might feel really safe at home because there's a very predictable routine. They know exactly what to expect when. But then They arrive at school, there's more noise, more social pressure, there are constant transitions, the routine isn't as predictable, and suddenly they feel entirely overwhelmed. And then you'll have that question from parents where they'll ask you, but how does that work? Because this teacher tells us that they're seeing behavior X, Y, and Z, but we see none of that at home. And the teacher complains that our child is having frequent meltdowns or isn't listening and participating. But actually, the child isn't choosing that particular behavior of, let's say, not participating and listening. It's that their nervous system is really having a tough time having to respond to the demands of the environment at school, whereas perhaps the demands of the environment at home aren't that intense for them to have to respond to. And there's that difference then between what we see at school and at home, for example.
And that is where the common misunderstandings often come in between parents and teachers, maybe. And also where I think there's often this perception that the demand, you were talking about the demand is different in the different environments, that the demand necessarily comes from the teacher, but it's not necessarily the teacher's demand on the child. It's often the demand of the environment, being in between other children, the posters on the wall, maybe the sounds, the road in front of the school that's busy, the bells. So I often sit with parents and then they say, but then the teacher must shift her demand on the child, but it's not necessarily only the demand from the teacher onto the child. It's I want to almost say the environmental demand and the perceived demand in that environment.
Exactly. We've got to remember that our nervous system is constantly in a state of receiving input, and that is from all senses where the input is coming from. So like you're saying, even a really busy road outside of the school where the windows of the classroom are open and the child hears the cars tooting and braking and driving could be incredibly overwhelming. And they might have a teacher who already is beautifully aware of this child's needs within the classroom and who is actually not putting much pressure on the child, but just maybe from an auditory senses perspective, the nervous system has so much to deal with that it's got actually very minimal to do with the teacher, as an example. Yeah. So we have to look at it from a really holistic perspective to realize that the nervous system is constantly receiving information from all of our senses.
I think it's sometimes difficult to really understanding the extent of the input that the kids are experiencing. In a conversation I had with one of my colleagues the other day, she brought my attention to the difficulties that the kids might be facing when they are at a sports event if it is windy. Because sensory-wise, the wind and the noise of the wind, and I mean, I've worked with neurodivergent and neurotypical people for so long. I'm very aware of the sensory differences and the sensory needs, but not once have I thought that the wind, and it makes complete sense. Even I'm agitated when it's really windy. But to actually name it, what to me was quite an eye-opener. It's like, wow, yes. Now it just makes so much sense. Why the kids find those days so difficult, hey? What happens when two dysregulated nervous systems interact? Whether it's the parent and the child and they're both dysregulated, or the teacher and the child and they're both dysregulated, what happens?
I think this is a very common experience that anyone can relate to. Anyone who's interacted with a child, whether they are a parent or a teacher, and they interacted from their own state of dysregulation while the child was dysregulated. And I think most of us can say wasn't the most successful interaction that we've ever had with said child. So we've got to remember that if that child who we are trying to interact with has a nervous system that is in some state of threat, they're yelling, they're refusing, they're melting down, they're very angry, they're anxious, that already actually activates the adult's nervous system. That's important already. On top of that, we as the adult, just in that moment before we start interacting with the child, our nervous system is already in some kind of state, just due to the day that we have had and the days prior that we have had with life's demands that it has on us. So now we are already in some sort of state. The child is in another state. That activates our nervous system even further. And we respond with stress or frustration or overwhelm or a sense of hopelessness. And now we have two nervous systems reacting to each other. And often the situation will escalate even further. And it's not because the parent is doing something wrong. It's simply because two human nervous systems are interacting with each other. And so that's really important for us to realize for a moment. It's two nervous systems reacting. And when we are mindful of that, that could actually help us to shift the way we think about how are we going to respond in that moment when we are already activated and so is the child.
And I mean, from my experience, and especially lately, the last year and a half, I see a lot more parents who are stressed and burnt out for various reasons, whether it's the work demands or the economy, or so we sit with a society, I feel, that is definitely more stressed, and burnout is very real. And we can understand how this sometimes must escalate difficult moments for the child.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had this experience myself 2 weeks ago. I have a 1.5-year-old son who is now definitely in the throes of toddlerhood and wanting to try everything, and the emotions are right up there. And I was in a physically exhausted state. I was stressed. And multiple times he would have a meltdown, and my ability to then go and interact from a nervous system state of calm was compromised. I couldn't do it. I just simply couldn't do it due to the buildup of stress, of fatigue in my own nervous system that I then brought into the situation where he was already dysregulated. And my attempts to try and support him to the best of my abilities was compromised due to my own nervous system state with which I entered the situation.
Yeah, I mean, that is why parents working as a team, those parents who are lucky to have a partner who is working with them, and not being a single parent maybe, but if you have a partner who is involved, that's why it's always so important for them to work together. I mean, in my family, I can go to my husband and say, I'm tapping out. I can't, I am not in the right frame of mind at the moment to deal with that situation. And then he automatically takes over. And the other way around, he might have had a stressful day at home, and he needs to have an interaction where he can say to me safely, you know what, I'm not in the frame of mind to do this right now. Can you please take over? That is so important. If you have that, if you have I want to say the blessing of having a partner that works with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we have now discussed, I mean, this is very real talk. We all experience this. Life is stressful. We burnt out. Our central nervous systems are often in high alert, which is obviously escalates the child's response when they are feeling dysregulated. So my question basically is what can we do? What role does almost co-regulation play between a parent and a child?
So the first important thing to understand around the concept of co-regulation is the younger a child is, the more premature a child's ability is to be able to regulate their own emotions. It is not something that we are born with as humans. We don't have this magical ability that when we cry when we are 2 years old because we are upset, or when we are 5 years old because our little brother just took our toy. We can't just magically soothe ourselves and feel okay again. And here is where we've got the beauty of co-regulation, where one more mature nervous system can come and teach the other nervous system how to regulate. And it simply means that when a somewhat regulated, because we can't always be entirely regulated when we enter a situation where our child is dysregulated. So when we enter it somewhat regulated, Our child will borrow safety from our nervous systems. So when the child is really overwhelmed, the presence of a somewhat calm, supportive adult can really help the child's nervous system gradually return to a sense of safety. And the beauty of this is when a child is exposed to this experience of this parent coming in with calm and supportiveness, that repetitive experience actually teaches regulation of emotions, but also resilience. When I am in a really difficult situation, I actually have the ability to find my way out of it. And I've learned that because I've got a parent who steps in, who's there with me in that moment to help me move through it. And then when I'm older, I can actually do it myself.
Absolutely.
That's the beauty.
Yes, that is the beauty. I often in my training with teachers, I mean, I mentioned earlier that mindfulness to me is so, so very important. And we often in teachers training, we provide the teachers with strategies to support the children. But my focus is often, or I usually start my sessions with strategies to support the teacher themselves, because we're also human as professionals and teachers and parents. And in the whole theme around mindfulness, a strategy just to maybe pause before you run into the classroom.
Exactly.
I know teachers are busy, they rush, they organize a sports event during break and phone a parent and need marking, and their minds are full of so many things that they need to do. But if we can have the shift that full mind to being mindful of maybe just regulating yourself, just take a moment and breathe and say, I'm going to be present in this situation now. When I walk into this class, I'm going to leave my full mind behind and be mindful of what is in front of me. The same with a parent on your drive home, to say that this is my time to shift from having a mind full of a bad day, a nasty boss, a toxic working environment, bad traffic. This is my time to shift that to being more mindful of my child receiving me at home. I think we can make such a difference in using our own more regulated state to help regulate our dysregulated children who doesn't necessarily have the cognitive ability yet to make these mind shifts consciously. So in terms of hope and change, can a nervous system actually change over time?
Yes, it actually can. And what makes the nervous system so wonderful is that it's really adaptable. And it's adaptable because if a child gets those repeated experiences that I spoke about earlier, where in a moment of dysregulation, a somewhat regulated nervous system enters the situation, provides safety, connection, and support, a very particular message is sent to that child's nervous system, which is the world is safe. There is safety for me. Whereas if a parent continue to respond from their own dysregulated state, screaming, shouting, ignoring, slamming doors, there's a very particular message that's sent to that little nervous system too. Whenever I am in a state of dysregulation, the world is not safe. There is no safety for me. But when that choice is made for a parent to enter a state of the situation with a state of regulation, then yes, over time, the nervous system can adapt and it can increase its capacity to stay regulated, even when the situation that the child is in is incredibly challenging. So there is loads of hope indeed.
Absolutely. So what I'm hearing, Megan, is in our attempt to change the central nervous system response, we can, or the kids can build resilience through the consistent safety and consistent connection.
Absolutely. It's all about that repeated experience. Then the nervous system learns, okay, I actually don't have to quickly move into a threat response. I actually build what we call a wider window of tolerance. I can tolerate stressful situations with more ease because over and over, there was someone who taught me how to do that by borrowing their sense of safety that they had within their nervous system, by borrowing that to me. And what's really important for parents to remember is that this will not happen overnight. It's not 2 or 3 interactions where you are in a regulated state with your child and then boom, bang, they've built up this huge tolerance for stress. It happens through the smallest of experiences or even bigger experiences where a child experiences connection and safety from a nervous system that is regulated in those moments where they are dysregulated themselves.
I love your reference to the window of tolerance. What I'm hearing is that as parents and professionals and teachers, the aim would be to build our own window of tolerance, to expand it, and as our own, which we can do consciously and mindfully. And the more we expand our window of tolerance, we can create opportunities for the children who are dysregulated to expand their own windows of tolerance. I really like that
Absolutely.
reference. So, Megan, if parents listening today could take away one key insight about their child's nervous system, what would it be? What's your golden nugget for today?
A metaphor that I often use is the idea of a house with a smoke alarm and a thermostat. So the smoke alarm has a job to detect danger, and then it sounds the alarm. It's designed to protect us, right? If there's smoke, it's going to make sure we know about it. And some neurodivergent children might have sensitive smoke alarms. Their nervous system might detect danger quite quickly, even when the situation isn't necessarily really that dangerous. So when that alarm goes off, what do we see? Really big reactions, shutdown, overwhelm. But then the good news is the house will also have a thermostat. And the thermostat helps the system to return to balance and stability. And the parents are the thermostats, of course. The teachers are the thermostats, of course. And we can teach that smoke alarm. And we can teach that smoke alarm that the thermostat is there to bring in the balance of a sense of safety and connection. And when safety and connection returns, we know that beautiful moments of learning, cooperation, and connection are possible.
Sure. In future, I think in the near future, Megan, we need to have a session so that we can learn exactly how the thermostat and alarm system works and the smoke system works. As we come to an end of today's conversation, because we ran out of time, unfortunately, I think one of the most powerful shifts we can take with us with this is that many of the challenges we see in our children are not about behavior that needs to be corrected, but it's about a nervous system that needs to be understood. When we begin to see our children through this lens, everything changes. That is my summary of today. And we move from reacting to responding, from a state of being reactive to a place where we can respond calmly or calmer, and also from correcting to connecting.
Absolutely, yes.
So from asking what's wrong to asking what does the child need right now. I think that is what I take from today's session. So Megan, thank you for sharing your insight and your expertise and your deep compassion for the families you support. Your work is just a reminder that when we create safety and we create the conditions for growth, resilience, and true connections, we can really support our children to shine. And to everyone listening, I invite you to pause and reflect. What might change if you viewed the next difficult moment, not as defiance, but as a signal from a nervous system asking for support? And if today's conversation resonated with you, I strongly encourage you to join our upcoming webinar with Megan, where we will move beyond, I think, the theory and the focus on practical to easy implementable strategies to support children in real everyday moments, whether you are a parent or an educator or a professional. So thank you for joining us on Oakley Connect. If this episode spoke to you, please share it with someone you need or you think needs to hear it, because understanding really changes everything. Until next time, take care.